Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. Today I am here with a bit of a throwback video. I'm going to go through all of the palettes that I have decluttered in my collection over the years, and I want to talk you through why. I recently thought of this video because I was redoing my spreadsheet and I went through like all of my hidden tabs with everything that I decluttered, and I thought that, I should probably delete that off so that the spreadsheet doesn't keep going. But before I deleted that, I took notes of all the palettes that I had decluttered in my collection over the years, and I wrote them down, so I thought I would discuss them with you today. I don't know if this is going to be interesting, but I thought it was quite interesting to go back and see what I have had in my collection and what I have decluttered. So I thought maybe sharing it in a video would be interesting for you guys too, and that's why we're here today. So I'm going to go through all of the palettes that I've decluttered. I'm going to share the palettes as well so you can see what they look like. But before we move into the first palette, if you're new here, please consider subscribing. I would love to have you in the family. Let's jump into the video. So I'm going to go through the palettes in brand order because that's how I had them organized in my spreadsheet, and I will talk you through them all. So I have quite a few palettes to go through, so I'm just going to jump in with the first one. And first up we have Anastasia. So the first palette that I have to share is the Anastasia Prism palette, which looks like this. And the reason why I ended up decluttering this one is because it had a lot of shades that I just didn't like. I feel like the color story was overall really interesting, and this was something that was on my wish list for a long time. And I actually bought this one like secondhand from eBay. And I was really happy when I first got the palette in my collection. I really enjoyed some of the colors in here, like the really bright, like yellowy, it's bright yellow shade. I really enjoyed, as well as like the peachy shades and some of the shimmers. But the shimmers just wasn't the best formula. And again, there was quite a few shades in here that I didn't really reach for, or I had a lot in my collection. And that's why I ultimately ended up decluttering that palette. So that is the first one. The second one is one that is relatively recent in my collection, and that is the Anastasia Jackie Aina palette. I realized while using this one, the quality in this palette was really good. But while I was using it, I realized that I kind of only liked half of the shades. And half of the shades I really do enjoy, and I love those eyeshadows. So I wanted to hold on to them in my collection. But I also had another palette that I felt similarly about, and that was the Subculture palette. So if you don't know, about like around November time last year, I believe it was, I actually ended up combining those two palettes. So I decluttered half of the shades from each and kind of combined them into one. So I still have some of the shades from the Jackie Aina palette, but the palette itself is decluttered, and that's why it's on the list. But you could also say that the Subculture palette is kind of hand in hand on this point, because I did kind of keep half of both of those palettes. And those are actually all of the Anastasia palettes. So let's move on to the next section, which is Colourpop, and I have quite a few palettes to go through from Colourpop. The first palette is the Elemental Surprise palette. This is the palette that I also got secondhand. I actually bought this one off Alexi like years ago now. She was declaring it from her collection, and I asked if I could get it from her, and she sent it over to me. So I really liked this palette when I first got it, and I really liked the color story and the shades that were in there. There was some like kind of duochrome shades, and when I first got it, I really did love this palette. But I felt like over the years, the formula really declined, and I just felt like the quality wasn't there. And I also had other like better kind of formulas of those shades. After a couple of years, like I got into like indie shadows, things like that, and I just felt like this wasn't up to par with the rest of my collection, and that's why I ended up decluttering this palette. Next up we have the Colourpop Yes Please palette, and I just felt like this had a lot of similar shades, and again the quality just wasn't there. I feel like that's like a tendency with all of my Colourpop palettes that I cluttered. They just wasn't like my favorite quality in my collection, and this palette ended up being quite old. It was my first ever Colourpop palette, I believe, and I had it for a long time in my collection. But after, like I said, a while, I just ended up decluttering this palette because of quality, and also because mainly the shimmers. I feel like the shimmers in the Colourpop palettes don't hold up very well. So I ended up decluttering this one, but holding on to my favorite shades from it. So that is the next one. The next two palettes kind of go hand in hand again. We have the Colourpop Soul palette and the Colourpop Mar palette. And I felt like these two palettes had some really unique shades in my collection, but some were very repetitive. So what I initially did was I combined these two palettes into one, and I hosted in my Mar palette. So at that point, I counted like the Soul palette as decluttered, although I still had some of those shades in the Mar palette. But ultimately, I just felt like I never reached for that palette. Maybe it was a quality thing again. Maybe it was because it didn't really draw me in. but I think I still have some of those shades in my collection, like the really, really bright, kind of like an almost neon orangey red shade. I know for sure that I have that in my collection still. So I did hold on to some of the shades from this palette, but from these palettes, but ultimately, again, I just felt like they didn't really belong in my collection, and I would rather just kind of hold on to the most unique shades. The next one is the Just My Luck palette. This was a monochromatic palette, and I love green shades. Clearly, I'm wearing greens today, but I haven't mentioned this today, but it's actually St. Patty's Day. That's why I'm wearing green, and I thought I would do a green look for St. Patrick's Day. But anyway, I do love greens, not just for this day, but in general as well. But I felt like the tones wasn't my favorite kind of greens in this palette. There was some shades that I really, really adored, and those again have gone into my singles collection. But I also felt like I didn't need a whole monochromatic palette like this in my collection because, again, I don't reach for those type of greens very often. And again, similar to a lot of other things, the quality just wasn't the best, so I ended up decluttering this palette. Then we have the Mint to Be palette, which is another like monochromatic palette. And I just felt like a monochromatic mint palette wasn't really what I needed in my collection. I kind of felt like, I don't reach for mints very often, like way less than I do greens, for example. And also a lot of the shades in here were repetitive, and I felt like a lot of looks ended up being similar. So again, I held on to a couple of shades and put them in my singles collection. But overall, I just ended up decluttering most of this palette. The shimmers, again, has kind of declined a lot, and I feel like I decluttered all of the shimmers from this palette now, even the ones that were in my singles collection. But yeah, again, I just felt like I didn't really need a monochromatic palette like this in my collection. So I actually decluttered most of my monochromatic palettes, by the way, from Colourpop. I just have the Aha Honey left, but I'm going to go through the rest. Actually, I think I only have one more to talk about, which is the Lilac Tob, which was the most recent out of the monochromatic palettes that I decluttered. And with this one, I felt like it was a similar thing. I didn't need a monochromatic palette, and I also feel like there was a lot of like repetitiveness in this palette too. I did write like that I liked the tones that were here and here. They kind of like, I don't know, I just love the like lilac tones in this palette. But again, I just held on to my favorite shades and decluttered the rest. And I'm just looking at the list, and I realized that I forgot to include one palette, which is the It's My Pleasure palette, which was a purple palette. And this one, again, I felt like the tones weren't perfect for me. There were a lot of like mid-tone to dark purples, which isn't really what I prefer. And some shades in here I do really like, and I still have a couple of these in my collection as singles. But there was just a lot of like mid-tone shimmers, which I don't really prefer. And also, again, the formula in the shimmers particularly wasn't there. So this was like an early declutter for me because I just felt like it wasn't the palette that I reached for enough. And again, those were all of the monochromatic palettes. However, we do have quite a few Colourpop palettes left to go. We have the Flut Pie palette next. And overall, I felt like this was too cool toned for me. And I had like similar palettes that I preferred. And since I don't reach for these kind of really cool toned purples a lot, or cool tone kind of mauves a lot, I felt like I only needed like maybe one or two palettes like this in my collection, and this just wasn't my favorite, so that's why I colored this one. Next up, we have the She palette, and again, this was an older Colourpop palette, and I felt like the quality, especially with shimmers, just wasn't there anymore. So I ended up coloring this one too. And again, I had long touchable mattes, which still live in my singles collection, but overall, this palette was decluttered. The next one we have is the Dream Street palette, which was a collaboration with Kathleen Lights, and I did really like this palette a lot, actually. I like the color story, and there was just a couple like repetitive shades which I didn't like, but overall I did really enjoy this palette. However, when I decided to cut down my collection a bit, this just had to go because it was like one of my least favorite palettes at the time when I did that big clutter, and that's kind of why I ended up letting this one go. Again, Colourpop palettes doesn't really excite me very much anymore, and that's why I've gotten rid of so many of them, and this one kind of fell into that category. We have two more palettes to go. We have the I Think I Love You palette, and I wrote this is a neutral palette, which meant that it was very, very repetitive in my collection, and ultimately I just didn't love it. A couple of shades in here were really nice, and again, I held on to them in my singles collection. But yeah, I just felt like I didn't need this palette, and that's why I let this one go. So then lastly, we have the Give It To Me Straight palette. And again, I felt this was a bit of a repetitive palette. I didn't really love the undertones of the shimmers either. Again, there was a lot of like mid-tone shimmers. And the mauve undertone just wasn't for me. Yeah, I just didn't love the shimmers in this palette, and that's kind of also why I let this one go. Next up, we have Juvias Place. We're moving on to the next brand now, and the first palette is the Masquerade palette. I said that this was a cool palette overall, but the quality just didn't age very well. I ended up having other palettes that I preferred, which is why I let this one go. So again, this fell into like when I did that big declutter, when I let go of all my least favorite palettes, this one kind of fell into that. And also I felt like the neutral rose, I guess, in this palette was a bit repetitive to me as well. So yeah, this one just was an easy declutter for me. They kind of have like sister palette to that though is the Magic palette, or like I had the mini sizes of both those, by the way. And I said I hit pan on almost all of the shades before I ended up decluttering this one. I prefer the color story of this one to the other, like the Masquerade palette, but ultimately again the quality just didn't age, and at the end of the day, when I decluttered it, I had similar shades that I prefer much better, especially like in my singles collection, but also in other palettes. So that's why I let go of the Magic palette. Next up we have the Tribe, which actually is a palette that I really, really loved. I love this palette a lot. I love a lot of the greens in here, and those are kind of my greens, like the more warm tone greens. I really, really love those. But there was also a couple shades in here that I never reached for, and the palette itself was very large for 9 shades. So what I ended up doing is I actually depotted some of the shades and I repressed them into my single collection. So I still have those really warm tone greens, and I do reach for them every now and then, but I ended up like saving so much space putting them there rather than having that big palette and a lot of shades that I didn't use. And I feel like when it comes to like a small palette like that, when it's a 9 pan, if I don't love all of the shades, like it's just a bit unnecessary, and I feel like, you know, maybe that's not the palette for me, and I could much rather use the potty shades that I prefer. We have the Sahar and 2 palettes next, and I did really like the shimmers in the palette, but I just felt like I had them over and over in my collection. And again, I feel like it was quite large for a 9 pan, so I ended up decluttering this one because I felt like I can pass it on to someone else rather than keeping that big palette that I didn't reach for very often because it was repetitive for me. The last Juvias Place palette we have is the Dece palette. I wrote in my comments that this was such a unique color story. I really, really loved the color story of this palette, and I did get a lot of use out of this color story in the palette itself, but ultimately, similar to a lot of other palettes on this list, the quality just didn't live up to the rest of my collection, and because of that I ended up decluttering this palette. It was a fun one though, and I feel like I got like my excitement out of it before I decluttered it, and then like once that excitement kind of died down, that's when I realized the quality wasn't there and I was ready to let it go. So those were all of the Juvias Place palettes. Next up we have Urban Decay, and first up we have the Naked palette. And this was, I think, my first ever eyeshadow palette, or at least one of my first eyeshadow palettes. And I said I used this palette a lot, and I ultimately ended up decluttering it because of age. It was very, very old when I ended up decluttering it. I think it was like 9-10 years old when I decluttered it, which is quite old. And I also felt like it was just a neutral palette, and even though I had a lot of nostalgia to it, the quality had declined, and also like, I don't know if it was just the quality had declined or also maybe it's because like better formulas had come out, but yeah, I felt like I had other things that I much preferred, and it was an easy palette to declutter with the color story because I had all of those shades. The hardest part about decluttering this palette was mainly the nostalgia factor, but that is the next palette. Then we have the Urban Decay Naked 3 palette, and I said similar to above, this was like a repetitive palette in my collection. It was also quite old. I was more keen to hold on to this palette though, rather than the original Naked palette. However, once I went through like my palette collection, I said I might declutter this one. One of my subscribers reached out to me, and she said that this was her absolute favorite palette in her collection, and I don't think they do it anymore. So she was wondering that if I was to declutter it, if I could send it to her, just so she can have a backup of the one that she almost had finished. So I ended up doing that because I felt like it was better to pass on to someone who would actually love the palette and use it up, rather than just sitting in my collection for like a couple more years before I decluttered it. So that was the reason why I ended up decluttering the Naked 3 palette. Next up we have the Ultimate Basics palette from Urban Decay, the Naked Ultimate Basics, and this was a really good staple palette. It was an all matte palette, or I think maybe it was one shiny shade, but it was a really good like staple palette, like I said. I honestly still think about this palette. It's one of the decluttered palettes that I have like let go of, that I still really think about a lot. I think at the time I didn't really need an all matte palette, but now I feel like that would have been perfect to have with all my inner shimmers. However, I do have all these shades in other palettes, so I don't necessarily need it. But again, I do think about this palette sometimes. At the time, I just didn't think it was necessary to keep this palette in my collection. Then the next brand we have is Dose Colors, and I only have one palette to talk about because it was the only palette I ever owned from this brand. I think actually the only product I ever owned from this brand, and that is the Francation palette. And I said this is another one that I still think about a lot. It was a really great quality palette, and I feel like it was really difficult for me to decide to let this one go because I did really enjoy it. However, it was again very repetitive in my collection, so that's kind of the reason why I ended up decluttering it, because I had these shades, and even though the shimmers in here were really good and really sparkly, my indie shimmers, which I had a lot of at the time when I decluttered this, was just better, so that's why I ended up letting this one go. And again, it was a difficult decision, but I'm glad that I did, because I'm sure that this would have used it in my collection and not been used much after decluttering it. Next up, we have the I Heart Revolutions Rose Gold Mini Palette. And I said I panned the sister palette of this, which was the Nudes Minis. And that was like one of my Panda palettes. I think it was my Panda palette 2019, I believe. And I just felt like the quality wasn't the best. When I panned it out of palette, it was an easy palette to pan, but I just felt like I have better things in my collection, so there was no need to hold on to this sister palette. And it just didn't excite me as well, so that's why I let this one go. Next palette we have is the NYX In Your Element Air palette. I said this palette had a lot of unique shades to me at the time, and that's why I bought it. But I think that's also because it was one of my earliest palettes in my collection, and I just didn't have that many colorful shades at the time. I felt like once I grew my collection, I ended up getting these colors that pop up in different areas, and the quality wasn't the same in the NYX palette, and that's why I ended up decluttering that one. I did hold on to a couple shades. Still to this day, I have a couple shades in my collection. The most unique ones still live in my single collection, but overall, the quality wasn't the best, and I kind of replaced this one with other things in my collection. The next two palettes I'm going to talk about together, and that is the Tom Ford Golden Mint palette and the Cognac Sable palette. And these were two of my earliest palettes. I got them maybe around like 2013, 2014. And these were like such good, like special occasion palettes. It had like some really sparkly shades, and at the time it was really hard to find those really fine, like beautiful, like shimmery, sparkly shades. And they were really, really hot at the time, and I loved these palettes. They were like two of my like palettes. I always went to these two when I wanted to have a special occasion look, when I went out, when I had like anything like that, Christmas, anything like any special occasion, I wore these palettes. And I probably would have held on to these for longer, but eventually I just felt like they aged and they didn't perform very well. And I did hold on to some of the special shades, like the sparkly shades in my collection, but I actually used one of them last year and I felt like it irritated my eyes, so I ended up decluttering those. So now these palettes are completely out of my collection, but I did let these palettes go because they were just like, they were too old basically. So that's those two palettes. We also have a Norse palette to talk about next, and this was the Jewel Intensity eyeshadow palette. And I said like this color story just honestly didn't make sense. I bought this one to use as like singles, and I had one of their single Jewel Intensity eyeshadows, and I still think I have that in my collection. It's one of the very few like singles that I still hold on to. Oh, actually, did I put that into my... Maybe I did actually repress that into my collection. No, I don't know. I still have that shade anyway, and I really did love that one. I think that was the shade Himalaya or something like that. I can put it here, but I really love that shade, and that's kind of why I bought this palette. But it was honestly like an impulse buy, because I bought this one the first time I visited Sephora, which was in Stockholm. And I just wanted to pick something up, and I saw this palette and I was like, oh my god, I want it. I was super excited about it. I remember like swatching this one in the car right home, and I was so excited about it. But it was an impulse buy. I didn't really look into it before buying it. And I felt like it was an okay palette, but it just wasn't for me. There was a lot of colors in here that was too deep and just things that I didn't wear very often. So yeah, it probably wasn't the best pick for me, so that's why I ended up decluttering it. Next up, we have a Charlotte Tilbury palette, and this is the Charlotte Darling palette, or like the ECI, something like that. I can't remember, but it will be up on screen. I said this is a beautiful palette, but I just decided to declutter it early on, just as it was too repetitive for me, and the quality was really nice. I did wear it a couple times and I did enjoy it. However, again, it was repetitive and I felt like I wouldn't have gotten enough use out of it. And it was also a gift for purchase, so I didn't pick it up myself, and that's kind of why I ended up letting it go, because I knew that it would just sit in my collection and not get used. So we have a couple more palettes to go. The next one is my Niki Tutorials and Beauty Pip palette, and if you followed my channel last year, you know this was my Panda palette for the first 6 months of last year. So I tried to pan it, but once I started panning it, I realized it just wasn't for me. So I ended up decluttering the majority of this palette at that time, and I still have a handful of shades left. But I do count this palette as decluttered because ultimately, like, most of the shades just ended up being crushed out of the palettes. We also have the Beauty Bay Book of Magic palette, which is a really good palette, but ultimately the color story just wasn't for me. I lusted after this palette for a long time. I bought it off eBay secondhand again. I really lusted after it, and I waited for a long time for it to be available, and I snatched it up straight away when it was. But when I actually had it in my collection, I realized that it wasn't like my favorite. There was a lot of shades in here that I didn't reach for very often. Like, there was a lot of blues and like dark shades, which isn't my favorite. Like, I don't mind the blue look, but like it's like those really smoky dark looks that I just don't reach for very often. So I ended up decluttering this one again, held on to a couple of shades. I did post a video last year when I decluttered this one, and actually the next palette I'm going to talk about, and I just kept my favorite shades and decluttered the rest. So that's why I let go of that one. The next palette, which also again was in the same video, was the Blueberry Muffin palette from BH Cosmetic. I did really love this palette. I love the color story, and I feel like this is such a nice one. The quality as well was super nice. And again, I have held on to quite a few shades from this one, but the reason why I decided to not keep the palette and like instead use the pot my favorite shades was because basically half this palette was more of a neutral palette, which was really nice, and it meant that the palette was very like versatile when it came to what kind of looks you can make, because you can make like really blue tone looks. It had a few more kind of purpley undertone blues. You can make more of a purpley look, but you can also make some nice neutral looks. However, that also meant that that neutral half of the palette was very repetitive to me, and I felt like I didn't need to hold on to the whole palette, and that's why I kept like the unique shades to me, which was like some more of those like blue and periwinkle kind of undertone shades. So I held on to those and I put those into my singles collection, and I could let go of all of those repetitive neutrals. Then we have come to the very final palette, and this one is the Sydney Grace Sweet Indulgence palette. And this was a stunning formula. It's a typical Sydney Grace formula, which I really love. I have a lot of Sydney Grace singles in my collection. This palette was a gift to purchase, and I did really like it. The reason why I ended up decluttering this was because I felt like the color story itself was a bit confusing to me. Some of the shades in here just didn't make sense, and I didn't love all of the shades either. And I felt like ultimately I would probably use these shades more if they were in my singles with the rest of my Sydney Grace shades, rather than in this palette, which I probably wouldn't use very much as like a palette, like a standalone palette anyway. I'll probably reach into it more as singles. So I did end up decluttering all the shades that I liked from this palette that wasn't too repetitive, and then the rest I did end up decluttering. So that's kind of what I did with that palette. But that's going to be it for today, you guys. I really hope you enjoyed it. Let me know if you have any of these palettes in your collection still, the ones that I've decluttered, and if you still love them, what do you think? If you have any other opinions than I do. Also, I would love to hear down below, what is the most recent palette that you have decluttered from your collection? I feel like everyone kind of decluttered palettes for different reasons, and I know some of the palettes in this video that I talked about is other people's absolute favorites. I know that for a fact. So it's just going to be interesting to know what is the most recent palette that you decluttered and why, because it might be something that I absolutely love, but it's interesting to see what other people's makeup preferences are. But that is all for today. I hope you're having a lovely day wherever you are, and I will catch you in my next one. Bye guys!